All right, some more car thoughts. I've been thinking about how one of the things that's hardest for modern folks to be able to wrap their head around is the idea that the generation gap is a myth, right? The generation gap is not real, so I call it a myth because I think it is. It fits the category of stories that we tell ourselves to define what kind of place we live in and make sense of the world as we find it. And there's a real separation between the generations that has been here since really about World War I. That was where the real big generation gap happened. The kids went off to war. If you read the war poetry before World War I and the war poetry after World War I, there's a distinct change in tone. And the reason is because of the mechanization of war. The kids go off to war, the young boys go off to war, and that's always happened throughout history. And then they come home and they struggle with the difficulties of what we call PTSD. That isn't a new thing. That's been around. You have accounts of the nightmares of people that come home from war and all. But what it used to happen was they'd get home and they'd talk to their uncles, they'd talk to their dad, they'd talk to their grandparents, their grandpas, and they'd say, I'm having these nightmares, and their uncles and dads and grandparents would say, it gets better. Don't worry, we got you. It gets better. Those go away. Come on back in, and they would surround the young men as they come back and reintegrate them into society, because they could say, I had the same experience. I had the same thing happened to me. Same thing happened to your uncle. Same thing happened to your grandpa. Well, what happened is World War I, when they mechanized the warfare, and the young men would come home, and they would go to, and the uncles would say, hey, I had a similar experience. Tell me about it. And then they'd tell them, and they hadn't had a similar experience. The horrors of the mechanization of war really separated the men of one generation from the boys of the next. And then World War II comes, and it happens again, and you get a deeper divide between the generations. Well, then what ends up happening is we start telling ourselves that that's normal, that the generation gap is normal. We tell stories of that normalize the generation gap, and it becomes a part of the myth of Western civilization, of the present postmodern Western civilization. And there was a generation gap in the ancient world at times. If you read Sophocles, you've got Aeschylus, you've got parents killing their children, you've got warfare between generations. The Roman Empire, they put a big emphasis on getting rid of the Greek version of the generation gap, and so that's why piety in Virgil has to do with the relationship between fathers and sons. It's actually quite beautiful, Virgil's description of the restoration of fathers and sons. But then the Middle Ages, you have a real burying, a lot because of the embrace of Virgil by Augustine, and then the covenantal continuity that Christianity brings and the Bible brings. And so you have fathers and sons for generations that share the same stories, share the same jokes, love the same things, pass on the same the same callings even, and that's all viewed as a good thing. Well, up until the wars come along, the world wars come along, and you have sort of a reinstitution of the myth of the generation gap. But there's a real need to bury that and to tell a different sort of story, to have stories that we hold in common, to have fathers and sons that come together around the same stories, come together around the same books, around the same movies, and in a real sense, that that is going to be at the heart of any sort of important cultural restoration movement, right? Whether it is in entertainment, our fathers and sons being brought back together and enjoying the same thing again? Are they building a vocabulary of stories that they share in common? Is one generation growing up and getting a particular kind of education, and the next generation is saying, "Oh, thank you for giving us the education that you got." Right? In the public schools, each generation experiments on the next generation with new teaching methods, new curriculum, new everything, and that's something that is that grows out of the myth of the generation gap. Parents assume their kids aren't going to like the same kind of music, aren't going to watch the same movies, aren't going to want to sit down and watch things together. And sometimes that's because, as parents, we assume it and then end up making it so. And sometimes it's because there really just isn't social pressure towards that, and so there isn't a broader community. There aren't things being produced for Christians and Christian conservatives that assume this is for the whole family. But that's why I get involved with the project. I get involved with is anything that is fighting back against the generation gap, that's thinking multi-generational, is something that I think here is what we need. And I think we need to be constantly looking for more and more ways to draw the hearts of our children towards us, to turn the hearts of our hearts towards our children, to develop multi-generational strategies of education, of investment, of businesses, of churches, to always be thinking, how can we build something that institutionally that's going to be here for my kids, for my grandkids, for my great-grandkids, and just look at the stories, the myths that we tell to explain the difficulties of relationships between generations, and replace them with different, better stories, and I think write some new stories that really resist that generation gap story. So that is a really, really important key to rebuilding any sort of society and restoring Western civilization at all. Thanks for joining me for some more car thoughts.